We're live. It's Saturday. It's 6:30. So why wouldn't we just do this thing? This week, we're going to be talking about grief and how we help our kids through it. So I'm Casey. That's Jess. That's Melissa. And we're about to, tell you something. We're the Libertarian Moms. We'll be right back. Season 2, episode 14. Just 2 episodes left in season 2. I don't know. I don't feel like it's been 14 weeks we've been doing this, but apparently it has. It's been 14 weeks we've been at it in season 2. This week's episode, a continuation of what we've talked about before, which is the monsters under my bed and in my head, which is our mental health series. And this is part 3, and it's about grief and specifically grief and justice. So we're going to talk a little bit about what are the indications of grief, how do we handle grief, how do we talk to our kids about grief, and then we're going to segue into some of this comfort that we take in justice having been served in light of what's happened in the news this particular week. So Jessica, you helped prep our show notes on parentingporcupines.com for today. You didn't help. You did them all on parentingporcupines.com. So why don't you lead us off with this conversation about grief? Where does this come from? Why are we talking about this?
A few weeks ago, actually, when we decided that we were going to do an episode about grief, it was right as we were saying goodbye to my grandfather. And so I was trying to deal with my grief and also help my kids with their grief. And so it just seemed like a really timely discussion, especially for me and the things that were going on in my personal life. But I do think it is an important topic because grief is something that we're all going to experience, right? I mean, if you make it into adulthood, you've likely experienced some sort of loss and some sort of related grief. And just having a discussion about how we work with our kids and how we talk them through that and help them through that, how we help them name their emotions and tackle their feelings, and how we help them help other people do the same. So.
And a good bit of it is about communication, right? A lot of it, I love that you said the phrase, name your emotions, right? Being aware that this is what's happening. And one of the articles that you posted in the show notes is 10 ways to help a grieving child. And so I wonder, where does the grief come from? So you had asked a great question, Jessica, about what was the first experience that you had with grief. So Melissa, why don't you take that one up? What was the first experience that you had? And then maybe segue into what was the first experience your kids had?
Well, I am super awesomely lucky. I lost my first close family member at 21. I was almost 21 when my first grandparent died. So, I realize that's strange, but it was awesome. But when I was little, we lost a dog who, and my family, we joke about things. Our processing mechanism is we joke, and we like to tell stories about the people. And my dog, we were in the process of deciding if we do a $5,000 hip replacement or say goodbye to our dog because she was 13 years old and in a lot of pain. And we like to say she made the choice for us. She ran into traffic, which was traumatizing for my sister and I, because my dad came in the house to get his gun to finish the job because she was just laying in the street. It was horrifying. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my sister just crying. We're just holding each other and crying. But luckily, that's about it from when I was a kid. And hello, child. We're in a different format. You can't see my little person.
Our weekly interruption. Hello, weekly interruption.
Go watch the movie. Go get the popcorn.
You know what's interesting about that, though? Because I think a lot of people, that's their first experience with grief, is the death of a pet, right? And we didn't have, when I was growing up, we really didn't have pets. My family's just not pet people, really. And so my first real experience with it was friends of mine who had lost a grandparent, and then friends of mine who lost friends. We had a friend that died of he wasn't my friend. I never knew him, but he died of a heroin overdose, and all of my friends knew him. And so here's this, we're, 18 years old when that happens, and I'm in high school, and Sean died. And the same thing happened in college. There was a gal that everybody else knew, but I didn't know her. She got hit by a train. And it was this kind of thing, like where there were these like accidents that showed up that happened that impacted other people. But grief was always sort of an arm's distance from me until my grandmother died in 2014. So here I was born in 1977, and the first like immediate relationship to me, and even that's not necessarily an immediate relationship, but I had two of my cousins died when they were little. They were toddlers. They were 3, and they were both in car accidents. That wasn't. I didn't really know them. You know what I'm saying? Like they lived in South Carolina, we lived in Virginia. Like I knew that everybody was sad. I could understand that there was this tremendous grief that other people were feeling, but I personally wasn't feeling it. And even when my Nana died, we had spent so much time together, and I'd worked so hard on that relationship and she was sick for a very long time, that even when that happened, for me, it was like, okay, this is how it's going to be. And I was prepared and I was ready. And so like, I feel like I'm like you, Melissa, I'm tremendously lucky in that way. Like, I feel like now I have to completely knock on wood over that, which is why part of when Jess was experiencing what she was experiencing with her grandfather toward the end of his life, what I was saying to her is like, hey, take what you can at this point. You're not going to ever regret taking what you can at this point. And you said yourself, Jess, that you guys had worked really hard on having a really good relationship. And so that's something that maybe you can take a little solace in at the end of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, but your boys knew him and spent time with him. How did they handle the end of that?
For Caldwell, it wasn't, because Caldwell's 9. And so he was really, really sad. But it wasn't just devastation. For Jackson, though, it was. Because we are a very close family, and I think I've mentioned this in prior episodes, but my dad's side of the family is extremely close. And so they have been a big part of our lives, of my life, of my children's lives. And so with Jackson being almost 13, I think it had a bigger impact on him because they had such a cool relationship. So, he struggled with that. He detached a little bit at first, but the thing that I did that I found was really helpful, and it wasn't something I ever thought I would do, but I felt the need to do it, and it helped me too. The day that we got the call, he passed away Easter Sunday that night. My dad called me Monday morning and told me. And so I told the kids. And so that afternoon, I made it a point to tell like some of my favorite memories, like some of my favorite stories about him, like how he got his nickname Yoda, and like these fun things that he used to do when I was a kid. And the kids really enjoyed that. And I think that, I don't know, it seemed to help. Thought that was cool. I hadn't thought about that until just now.
It's interesting though, because I still tell stories about my Nana and my Papa too. Holly knew Papa a little bit better because Papa just passed in 2018, but so she knew him a little bit better. But they were still, I think, her grief for both of them is really adjacent to my grief and my mom's grief. Right? It's not as much that she feels their loss as much as she's sad for us because she knows that we feel their loss. And I feel the same way about my uncle. He passed in 2018 as well. My grief is primarily for my mom, who was his twin sister, and his wife, who lost her life partner, right? Like I tend to have a tendency to sort of like disassociate in that way because I feel like I guess I do personally feel a sense of loss, but it's not nearly to the capacity as these other people who are a little bit more maybe a little closer to them. I don't know. Is that weird that I'm like, I don't have the right to grieve. These other people are grieving, but I don't necessarily mean it that way as much as I'm just like, I have my thing, but my thing's nothing in comparison to what these others are feeling. So I'm not sure how healthy that is. I'm sure there's an article out there somewhere telling me how unbelievably unhealthy that is.
That sounds like empathy to me, which is not a bad thing, right? So.
Yeah, it really is. I think in the most part that I bet, again, because I'm like Melissa, I've been really lucky.
Yeah, and I do the same thing. It's part of my grieving process. It makes me feel better to help people. Mm-hmm. So my grandmother's brother passed. I miss Uncle Bob. I love Uncle Bob. I miss him, but it was her brother. Auntie Brenda's lost her husband. Like, how can I help them feel better? Helps me feel better.
Yeah, that's probably the way I'm coming at this too.
Yeah, it wasn't very personal.
Mm-hmm.
They live in Savannah. I saw him twice a year, you know. But yep, go on.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I think too, when I was looking at, two things. When I was looking for images to go with the show notes, and the show notes are out on the blog on parentingporcupines.com, I put in the word grief as a search for these images, and these images of grief they're devastating. I mean, and I'm sure that most of these images are actors, and yet still the emotion that they're portraying, and like Pexels, Pexels.com. But even still, like, I was kind of blown away by it, because I just thought, wow, these images of grief are really powerful. We watched Steel Magnolias, right? And you get to the end scene where they're burying Shelby, and of course Holly's devastated because Holly's got
spoilers.
Holly's got this running joke that if you've not yet seen Steel Magnolias, I'm sorry. Like, that's Lord have mercy. Like, where have you been? It came out in 1989, Melissa. You have literally no excuse for not having seen Steel Magnolias. There's just no excuse.
But have you not seen it, Melissa? Wait. What?
I haven't seen anything. This is how my husband feels every day.
Well, anyway, so we get to the end of the movie, and Holly's devastated because her favorite character has died, and now it's become this like running joke where Holly will pick out a character as the movie's beginning, and she'll be like, he's gonna die, isn't he? Because my favorite character always has. I'm like, well, you always pick the Mercutio. Of course your favorite character is gonna die. You always pick Mercutio.
You have a type.
So yeah, but okay, so we're a little off topic now. But so Jessica, as you were talking about going through listening to your kids, acknowledging your kids, reassuring your kids, I love the idea of telling these fun stories and happy memories that make a connection to how grateful we are to have had that person in our life. And I have that phrase of everything that lives must die. This is something that we have come to expect. But again, it comes from a position of sincere privilege that I haven't had to experience the kind of devastating loss that we know some of our audience members have had to experience. That said, where do we take comfort? How do we take comfort? Because this week we saw a verdict come down on the Derek Chauvin trial, and we have this. Is it relief? Is it justice? I mean, what are your thoughts here? Because this is not something that we've even talked about really in my house. We haven't really followed it that much in our house. It hasn't been omnipresent for us, although I know it is on the national conversation. So Jessica, segue us a little bit there to the collective grief that we have over this.
Well, I think there are two parts to this really, because while we're watching this trial, and again, if you've watched any of our episodes in the past, you know that we watch a lot of news in our house. My kids are pretty up on current events. And so they ask a lot of questions. They ask a lot of questions about these things when they're reported. And I think children are especially curious when there are things involving police officers, right? Because they are growing up, they're taught to trust police officers. They're there to protect and serve and that sort of thing. And so when they see these news stories like what happened with George Floyd, and then they're seeing the trial of Derek Chauvin on the television, because it was on TV for days, right? Nonstop for days. And then, they're reading the verdict on primetime news. My kids see that. And so, having that discussion about that and how we can take some solace in justice having been served. However, we still grieve for the life that was lost. We still grieve for the family who no longer have their loved one with them. And that is very sad that we have to experience that grief to get that justice.
Right.
But the other thing about this week that kind of, I think, made it a little bit even more difficult for our kids, if anybody else's kids out there were watching, is moments before the verdicts were read. Ma'Khia Bryant was shot and killed in Columbus, Ohio by a police officer, who, by by all appearances was acting in protection of another child. And we can talk about who did what thing and who should have done this thing differently and whose intent was what. But at the end of the day, again, a police officer is going home on administrative leave, and he's most likely devastated. I would hope that he's devastated having taken a life. And then there's a family who's going to mourn the loss of a child. And I think that probably hit closer to home for kids, that seeing that on the news, maybe a little, it feels different to them because it's a kid, right? She was a kid. And so I think talking to children about how they're feeling and that it's okay to feel like that. And then also being part of a community that's grieving at the same time, because they're not alone in that. Other people are feeling that grief too. And feeling that together and working together to make positive change out of that grief, I think is a very important conversation.
You're on two particular things I want to point out here, and Charlie mentioned in the comments on YouTube that she was a foster kid, right? And so she's in the system. So so that's something to keep in mind too, is where was the care for her for a very long time, and what had her life been like? What had her circumstances been like? And what led to that really just a tragedy. It's just a tragedy. And I think when we go back to like the Sandy Hook experience, I mean, I just cried my eyes out over Sandy Hook, right? Like all of us just have this collective grief over Sandy Hook. When we see school shootings, when we, as a community, when we watch this devastation, there's a sense of that. I think when you see candlelight vigils, when you see flowers being laid at the places and this kind of stuff, all of that is the community grieving together and expressing that sorrow for the fact that life is risky. It's difficult to live in any society. And even our society is a lot safer than some of the others that we're familiar with all over the globe, right? And so I think taking that it's no longer about like my personal experience, my personal grief. It suddenly becomes about all of us feeling sad together, and how do we process that together. I haven't necessarily been able to bring Holly into any of those sort of collective grief experiences. I don't know, maybe, I don't know, maybe I should do a better job of that. But I think it's healthy to have kids be aware that that's a thing, right? Like we probably shouldn't shield them from the reality that death is out there. It's an ultimate, what would you call it? An inevitability, right? For all of us. What do you think, Melissa? How soon do you think kids should be introduced to death? And the reason I asked this, like, we went to we did not go to my first cousin's funeral. When he died, he was 3 and I was like 6 or 7. But we did go to Amber's funeral, and I was 13 when Amber died. She was 3. And we did go to Amber's funeral, and I remember being there. I don't remember really knowing what I was doing there. And again, like it mostly being other people's grief, my Uncle Wesley, my Aunt Sharon, their grief. She was their only child. And, but I don't know. Do you keep your kids home from this stuff? Do you shield them from this stuff?
The only funeral that my kids may have gone to was my Uncle Bob, and he was 2. My eldest was 2. I only had 1 kid at the time. My grandparents, I didn't go. My mother-in-law, I didn't go. I was home with the kids. My husband went to, his mom's funeral in Connecticut. And both my grandparents had funerals in Connecticut, but I had gone up prior to them passing, like right the last week.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't going to go back up for the funeral with the kids.
Right.
But
I mean, Holly went to my papa's funeral. We didn't, I don't think she went to my Nana's funeral. I think she stayed with Charlie's mom when Nana died because she was just like 4. But she did go to Papa's funeral with us. She was with us for all of that.
My my children and their experience. My mother-in-law lives on top of my fridge because she was cremated, and we She's literally on top of my fridge. I talk to her because we're and my kids talk to her because I'm like, look at what I have to put up with. Your son did this, but it's I know it's weird. I miss her. I love her, so I talk to her because it makes me feel better. But we're gonna do a memorial and a thing and plant a tree.
Right.
We just haven't yet.
Yeah.
So she lives on and my kids think they think it's hysterical. They love that Grammy lives on the fridge. They don't think it's weird at all.
You know what though? I kind of dig that. I kind of dig the idea of that at the very least. I mean, you guys know I have two novels. The first novel's After December. You've both read After December, and the second one comes out in August. It's Before Pittsburgh, and Before Pittsburgh is fully Brian and his grief, right? So in After December, Brian's best friend commits suicide. It's 5 days worth of just right after it happens, and it's pretty immediate and it's pretty raw. But then there's like this gap. And then there's 3 years. And that's what Before Pittsburgh is 3 years. So I'm writing through Brian's grief. And I got to tell you, like, Brian's grief is my grief. It was my grief over my Nana. It was my grief over my papa. It was my grief over my parents' divorce. It was my grief over like anything over COVID, my God, right? Like all of us, our lives getting shut down and getting put away. Like there were moments last spring and last summer that felt so deep in the grief and you kind of like, I don't really know why I feel this way, but then it's like, I miss live music. I miss hugging my friends. You know what I mean? Like we miss baseball season. Yeah, we miss football, right? Like and so I think that grief isn't necessarily about other human beings dying. Sometimes it's about the loss of something and moving forward without that thing. I know people who've been divorced that have said that there was a tremendous amount of grief that came with their divorce, to see the end of something that they didn't expect to end. So like all of that, it sort of manifests in its own way. And then we have the stages of grief, which is like a convenient vocabulary for it. But it's not exactly like a college curriculum where you can just like sign up for the anger course and it's over after 6 weeks. You know what I mean? Like
that would be awesome. We should do that.
Let's just check these boxes off and move on with our lives. And it comes back on us in strange ways and at certain times that we don't really expect. But what I think is a universal experience. And so maybe it is worth just keeping that conversation alive all the time. You know, you look like you're struggling with something. Maybe it's some of that grief that you've still got, swimming around in your head or in your heart. I don't know.
Yep. My kids have learned I just randomly burst into tears. We were watching a movie. My kids look over at me. There are tears streaming down my face. And Mom, what's wrong? That character in the movie sounds just like my grandfather. And it hits you, right? You just get like these I'm fine. It's the random moment. Something hits you out of nowhere and you're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
That's him. That's her. Yeah. And it all
but
comes
I love
back,
that
but
though.
then you're okay. But then I get to tell them whatever story it was about that reminds me of my grandpa because this time we did this. Right. And then they get to experience him again, even though he's gone.
Well, and I think it's good though that we talk to our children when we feel grief too, because it lets them know
they're normal.
First of all, that's normal. Yes, it's normal to feel those things, and it's okay to talk about it, right? That it's okay to name it, to work through it, to talk through it if you need to. But another important thing that it helps to teach children is that empathy, right? And how important that is, because if you open up and you let them in and you're honest with them about what you're feeling, then you're giving them some level of responsibility in helping you, right? Like that feels good because they can help you. And so I think it just fosters that that desire to help people and that desire to be there. Even at the youngest of ages. I know at least for my kids, it does. When I'm honest with them, they appreciate it and they want me to feel good, and it makes them feel good when they can help me feel good if I'm sad. And so I think these conversations are good to have with kids. I think it's good to be honest about these things at age appropriate levels.
Yeah. Don't lay your burden on them, expecting them to help you.
Well,
Right.
so that
Yeah.
brings on a whole other conversation too, right? Because we are going to be experiencing um, while our parents are losing mates, right? While our dad dies and leaves mom, mom dies leaves dad, right? Like as we get older, we're going to be seeing that, and even my mom losing her brother and losing her dad. Her grief is so sort of all consuming that I don't know what to do or how to help, right? And at the same time, I have my own grief that I'm working through and I'm dealing with, and so it becomes, I think, a little bit of a balancing act too about how much do I show, because Melissa, you're exactly right, don't burden your kids with that, and at the same time it's like, but let them help to an extent, but
Yeah, but
also
don't
recognize
pretend
that their
everything's
grief is
fine.
valid, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's so complicated, right? But we've always been about being authentic with our kids. It's
Right.
always about being authentic. If you're an F-bomb using mom, fuck it, do it, right? Like, that's fine. If you're the drinking mom, right, just do it, right? Like, if you're the rule laying mom, Jess, looking at you, like, that's fine, just do it, right? So so we've always been like, I am who I am, and my kids deserve my best, the best version of me, but at the same time, the best version of me sometimes is a little bit broken, a little bit fragile, and it's okay to show that as well. And so I don't know, I'm sort of leaning on the side of like authenticity, where, and I told you guys this on our rule breaking episode, where I was like, sometimes I just say, I don't really know what to do here. I'm not sure how to handle this right now. I'm a little deep in my grief right now. I'm not sure how to interact with you over this, because I do feel sad, and I'm not sure how to share that with you without bringing you into my sadness. I don't know.
Yeah.
So far,
Sorry,
we've been
accounting
lucky.
emergency at work.
An accounting emergency on a Saturday.
Oh my God.
That's frightening.
It's been a long week.
For a lot of people. It's been a long week for a lot of people. So when we think about the community grief, right, go back to this collective grief. When you see this on national television, when you're being told, here's how to talk to your kids about George Floyd, here's how to talk to your kids about, all these things are happening. How do you feel about that? Do you feel like maybe I need some help talking to my kids about this? Or what are your thoughts, Melissa? We talked about this in the grief cycle episode too, where we said,
back in January, yeah.
yeah,
No, we talked. I don't know. I've half forgotten the question. We talked, specifically about George Floyd in that situation. We talked a lot about that over the summer when it was, the cities were erupting
fresh.
and everybody was going nuts. That we talked about it then. I don't know that I've given them an update about what's happening, because
Right.
I don't think they remember or care, or it's even on the radar. But with speaking of institutional memory and sadness and grief, I don't know if y'all watch Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I'm
We
not going to
do.
spoil it. The finale was yesterday. I'm not going to say a word. Watch it.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
We're on episode
And
4.
that show has opened up a lot of conversations about things like institutional grief and yeah.
Oh,
It's a
good.
good show.
That's good to
Watch
know,
it.
because we finished episode 3 last night, and we're binging the next few episodes tonight and tomorrow night to get ready for the finale.
The finale is episode 6.
Yeah,
That's it.
so we're
6
not too far away.
So good.
So Jessica,
good.
and when you go back to your family was close, I want to unpack that just a little bit. Your dad's family spends a lot of time together. They come to baseball games. They're supportive of all things other than holidays, right? That sort of thing. And that's what you mean by close.
Yeah, like I've lived with every member of my father's family. My dad has 2 brothers. So after my parents divorced, we lived with my grandparents, my grandmother, and my grandfather, who recently passed away. We lived with them for about 6 months while my dad got things settled and he could buy a house. When I came home from college, because I went to college for 3 semesters, And then I came home, and my dad had gotten married, and she had a son, and there was no physical space for me in the house that they were living in. And so I lived with his youngest brother for a year while I saved up money to get my own place. And then after Jackson's dad and I split up, I lived with my dad's middle brother and his wife for a year while I saved money to buy a house. So I have lived with my grandparents. I have lived with both of my uncles at some point in my life. So yeah, we're very close. We take good care of each other. And of course, with life, everybody's busy now. So we don't see each other as much as we used to. But yeah, they're a pretty cool family. They don't watch this, but if any of them ever do, I don't have to tell them how blessed I am or how blessed I feel that they're my family. So
I think we thought of ourselves as being a really close family too, especially my sisters and I, as my parents were divorcing, we spent a lot of time together. And then the older we got, the more we sort of got into our own lives and doing our own things. But now I think our family is extended to include our friends, to include some neighbors, to include the people like you guys that we spend a lot of time with. The people that we know when we need help, they're going to come and help us. And so when they're hurting, we hurt too. And if there's a chance that we can help them or console them or in any way simply empathize with them, we just always want to know that I want to know that they know that I'm there for them in that way. I had two friends that both lost parents in 2019, and every now and then I just send them little text messages like, "Hey, how you doing? Just thinking about you and hoping things are okay." And one of them will inevitably respond like, "How did you know? How did you know I needed somebody to just reach out today and ask me how things were going?" Like and we talked about that in one of our other the Monsters Under Our Bed ones, where we were talking about how do you lend support to your friends when you know that that's something that they're going through. And I think grief is part of that. And again, because it's not like it's a step-by-step path. Sometimes there are these sorts of I was going to say like redactions, but what I mean is like where you go back to a step prior.
Days.
Yeah, some bad days. Some bad days. We had one question, which was, how far do you push grief? With the example that Kobe Bryant was a great player, but he stopped the news for a week. There were people in the streets grieving Kobe Bryant, people who'd never met him, never talked to him, didn't really know anything about other than his public persona, right? So what about that kind of grief in terms of, and again, maybe this is a little bit like the George Floyd grief, where it is a collective, we all understand this person had an impact on us as a society kind of grief.
Well, I think it's because Kobe Bryant did so many good things for other people, right? I mean, any of us who are of any age,
she means old.
But
old people.
We remember a time when Kobe wasn't so popular. Like, he was popular for basketball, but he was unpopular for some other unsavory things that may or may not have happened. We don't know.
But then we watch him. He has this like redemption arc, right, where he has his family and he cares for them and he starts to give back.
But he did so many good things in the community, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that as a community, you grieve that loss. You're grieving the loss of the person, and you're grieving for their family, but you're grieving the loss of that community because you've lost someone who cares about everyone, who helps everyone, who does for everyone, and that's there are, I don't want to say there aren't a lot of people out there who do that, because there just aren't a lot of people out there who can do it to the level that a celebrity can, that a millionaire can. But I think that if you walk that back and you look at, like, my husband, he had a Boy Scout leader and he died several years ago, and it was crushing. It was like, and I have never seen a funeral with as many people as there were at this man's funeral. He was an incredible man, and he had this huge impact on so many lives, and our community grieved his loss, the loss of him, because he was he was a contribution. Like, he was just walking, breathing contribution to our community, and him not being there now is it's sad. It's sad for a lot of people.
Well, and I think some of that is the suddenness, right? Like if we look at something like Kobe Bryant or Princess Di, some of it is the suddenness with which they're ripped out of this collective story we were all telling about them, right? So I think that's part of that. And then the other piece of it is I think we like to be part of something that's bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
And sometimes that something that's bigger than ourselves is that big. Sometimes it's 80,000 strong, right?
Yeah.
My Uncle Howard was that kind of man that you're describing. He in his community, and I knew him as my uncle, as my mom's twin brother. Like, so I knew he had a business. I knew that he was active in his church, but his funeral was that way, where the people that came to, the line was out the door for hours. We stood there with people coming and telling us how grateful they were to have had him in their life. And my cousins, I think, took some solace in that too, because that's part of what this piece is about, right? Is like, where do we find that comfort when we know we're not going to have that person in our life anymore? And sometimes that comfort is in knowing that other people are missing him just as much as we are, or hurting like we are. Sadly. This is a really sad episode, by the way.
It's
My
a good
God.
conversation, though. It's a good conversation because it's not something that a lot of people talk about. I mean,
No, that's
you know,
You don't grieve in public.
no, you don't.
And we're taught to keep that sort of stiff upper lip and be
personal,
strong.
yeah.
I mean, not nearly as bad as they are in Britain, but we're taught to keep our grief to ourselves. And if you've seen like some of the footage from like Afghanistan and some of these other cultures where they grieve so suddenly, and it's sort of embarrassing that you're like, what? Pull yourself together. What's going on? Right? Like, I mean, come on. At the same time, you're like, how cathartic must it be to be allowed to be that open and that devastated in public, right? I don't know. I'm struggling with this topic a little bit more now as we get a little deeper into it. Like, I'm not sure what to say that's meaningful other than I think it really goes back to authenticity and letting your kids see you for who you are.
And I think showing them the same grace that you show yourself, right? I think that you have to let yourself go through those stages, and they look differently for each person. They're not, nobody's grief is ever going to look the exact same as another person's grief.
Right.
But I think, it's not only being authentic with your kids and letting them see you grieve, or just being led into that so that they have some sort of visibility into it, but letting them do the same thing, right? Like letting them be open about how they're feeling and what they're grieving feels like, and the things that they need to talk about and work through, and letting them be authentic too, right?
Yeah, I'll agree with that. I think that's actually the perfect place to finish this conversation. Next week, we're going to be as authentic as it gets because our husbands are coming in here to check us.
And we're going to tell them there's no stories. You can't say anything.
My favorite part about this idea of next week's season finale, including our husbands, was that they all three had the same response, which was why? Why would we do that, right? And they're probably watching right now, like, why would we even jump in on this? But so next week it'll be 6. You'll see all 6 of us will look like the Brady Bunch. And we're going to talk live and with our husbands about what it means to be co-parenting,
oh my God,
what it means to be, I know, what it means to be in a partnership and equal partners in our families and in the domestic lives that we've built together. So next week's season finale, the husbands will be here. Thanks, Jessica, for prepping our show notes tonight and for being honest and vulnerable with us about your grandfather. I'm so sorry for your loss. I really am. All right, that's it. We'll see you next week.
Bye, guys.